This is the Self-Taught or Not podcast with
Dylan Israel
and Eric Hanchett, where we teach you the do's and don'ts of software development from two software development professionals, one self-taught and one not.
Hey everyone, I just want to tell you that I have a new course called Vue 360 out. It's a course on Vue.js. You can find it at course.vuecourse.tech. It's basically everything I know on Vue.js in one amazing course. I'm really proud of it. So if you go to course.vuecourse.tech and you buy it, you actually get also my full 6-hour Nuxt.js course if you buy it today. So make sure you go to course.vuecourse.tech. The cart is closing very soon. So make sure you check it out. And if you do, it helps support the podcast. Thank you.
All right. Today we're going to be talking about something that's related to agile software development, something near and dear to my heart, to making you not only a better developer, but to writing better quality code. And that's pair programming and mob programming.
What about Apple programming and Peach programming?
Is Apple programming where you program something and then it slows down after the next update?
That's pretty much it. You got it. Yep.
Yeah, I nailed it. I know.
Everyone that's listening right now comes for the jokes because that's what we do here.
The jokes. Some are hit or miss, as I've found out in my relationship. I always think I'm funny. She sometimes just the quote I get is "I'm done with you." That's the quote when they miss. But so pair programming, much like a partnership, I suppose, in that sense. Is something that you're probably already doing to a degree without actually realizing that you're doing it, although you're not doing it as long or maybe in the correct fashion. But pair programming is all about teaming up with another developer and solving a problem, sort of a driver and a navigator mentality, as you might do on like a road trip almost.
Yeah, I like this concept of trying to help people out together, like you're both working together, one goal. One thing that I know a lot of junior developers are nervous about is that they're going to be thrown into an environment and not know what to do. They're simply going to look at their code and freeze, or not know what the next step is, or something they think that everyone's going to judge them because it's going to take them, 3 times as long as someone else. But if you take a junior dev and pair program with them, with like a senior or more intermediate developer, I mean, that can really help out not just the code to be better, be a better quality code, but, help the self-esteem, help the junior dev out. I think that helps.
Yeah, it definitely does. And so, the way that this typically works is you'll be pairing up on a ticket or a user story, and one person will be actually writing the code. The other person won't even have a laptop out, and you'll be talking through, oh hey, do this, and then one person will write the code, and it's a conversation. But typically the navigator is going to be like, hey, do this, do that, or you'll be doing something and they'll pick up on some mistakes. I mean, how often have you been writing code and then you go and you get, your 5 lines in or whatnot, and then you're like, oh, it's not working. Then you got to go debug those 5 lines, see what's there. The navigator's role is to say, oh, hold up, you missed something, or oh, hold up, you meant to pass an object instead of an array, whatever it may be. And that actually speeds up development, which is sort of one of the concerns from developers and from the business, which is always, deliver as many features as fast as possible.
And it feels a little counterproductive at first, because you think that if you get 2 people looking at the code at the same time, it's going to take you twice as long. But in reality, and that it can actually save you time. Do you think that's true, Dylan?
Oh yeah, it's definitely true, and there's been studies sort of pointing to that. So, and it's the same argument that's always there, right? Anytime developers ever do anything for quality, like testing, for instance, like, hey, we do unit tests, we don't have time to do testing. Well, then you really need to do testing. Like it's kind of like, because it does, it's the same slow down to speed up. So like if you go on with the wiki for pair programming, and this is just one example, when I was reading Code Complete, one of the cool things about it is that it had hundreds of references to stats to support a lot of this stuff. But one example from a paper back in 2006 is that there is a 15% increase in productivity and nearly double the amount of defects, lesson rather, has the amount of defects that pair programming has. So not only are you delivering more faster, it's actually a better quality product in the through this process rather than just sort of going the solo and I guess really the typical route.
Yeah, this is really interesting because I feel I think people who don't understand it, it's hard for them to grasp why it's better, but it definitely works. Yeah, I agree.
If you've ever seen the God, I'm forgetting the name of the airplane movie where Tom Hanks is in it and they crash the plane in like the Hudson River. But there's a scene in that movie with the two pilots where they're trying to figure out, they have 60 seconds before this plane is going down. And what happens is one person becomes the driver and the other person becomes the navigator. And it's sort of, they're working together, but one's focused on a single task of writing the code or solving the issue. And the other is they're supporting that person. And if you go and watch that 60-second scene and relate it to pair programming, it becomes pretty evident how this can work out much better for your organization and for your team in the not only in the long term but the short term. I think there is in the short term maybe some hiccups that happen as you get comfortable. Sometimes people feel a little bit like, oh hey, why'd you do it this way, and aren't really quite there to say that to their teammates, but it definitely will make you a stronger team once you get past some of that.
Yeah, and like anything else has a little bit of a learning curve and it takes a little bit of time for people to get used to it. I had an experience once where I was pair programming for an interview. So I was flown from Reno all the way to Chicago, and then I was pair programming pretty much all day. And they actually had an app that allowed them to pair program with people that were working from home. So we had like 3 people pair programming together, and it was kind of weird with 3 people. I know it's mostly 2. I think the third person was just like an observer during the interview, but they could do it that way. And we'd have 2 keyboards, 2 mouses, all connected up to one computer. So that way I could type, and then the other person could type, and then that. And I know that's probably not typical. I think usually with pair programming you will have 1 keyboard and 1 mouse, but in this case they had 2. And it was a little intimidating because I was like, at first I was told to drive, but then at other times I was what's the other one? You're the driver or the
and the navigator.
Yep, the navigator, as you just said. So at times when I was, I couldn't really navigate because I didn't know the code base. So I was sort of the driver and writing half the time, but then I wouldn't be sure, like, I was nervous during the interviews, like, can I Google this? Like, I don't know the answer to this. And the navigator will be like, no, well, you need to do this. And I think it led to them to believe that because I had a lot of nerves back then. This was quite a few years ago, and I wasn't as skilled as I am now in web development. But I think the pair programming led them to believe that I couldn't do the job and I didn't get the job. But in fact, I think I could have done the job. It's just I was so nervous having this other guy over my shoulder telling me what to do, and I didn't get enough time to show what I could do. And I think that's mostly my fault. But that's like the first experience I had with pair programming.
Yeah, I think anytime you get introduced to something new during a job interview, it's going to be more stressful than even a typical job interview is. I will say, I think the majority of people, and again, if we're going off some of the stats on the wiki here, 96% of people said they enjoyed it more than actually programming alone. So once you get in that flow, it'll be a much more enjoyable experience. And I think it's also worth mentioning that when you're pair programming, you're supposed to swap between the roles, right? There's not really a set time amount, oh, hey, now it's my turn, this turn. You sort of figure out what works for you. Sometimes you may not switch at all, right? For the session, you might go till a meeting and go through there. I know that I really enjoyed it when trying to skill up some of the more back end heavy devs on the front end, where I would at times let them do their own solution for something that was it would work, but perhaps not the best way, and then being able to sort of mentor them in the right direction, saying, "Oh, well, why'd you do it this way? Oh, I did it this way. Well, what do you think about this?" And so there's a lot of sometimes it can be frustrating your first sort of couple times, but I think like much like doing pull requests, there's sort of a demeanor that goes along with it, so that it doesn't, when you do stumble, you don't feel like, oh, I'm so stupid, or like or like you feel like you're being judged as much as, and I guess in an interview process you are being judged, but in a typical team environment, you're sort of working together more than being judged.
It's a good point bringing up the pull requests. Like I've worked in organizations where I get barely any feedback from my pull requests. It's like, oh, you got a console log here. Okay, get rid of it. And then I've been in organizations where pull requests are scrutinized, meaning like the reviewer goes through it and actually, really properly does a pull request. Now, there's times we can argue that you can really overdo a pull request if you get really, really nitpicky. But then I think that's usually better than someone that does really terrible pull requests and doesn't give you any feedback. Like me and Dylan worked together on a project, and he was actually giving good pull requests. Like, hey, this is the better way of doing it, or hey, can you do it this new way? And I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But until you're used to that type of feedback, it's kind of hard for some developers. And I guess making that correlation between that and pair programming is a good one, because when you first start pair programming, you can feel like, wow, this guy's judging me and I'm doing everything wrong, especially if it's like a senior dev versus a junior dev, or maybe you're both seniors, but one guy knows the code base a little bit better than the other person. And you kind of have to take your ego out of it and just take the constructive feedback and criticism. And there's probably an art too when you're being the navigator and just being able to express your thoughts a certain way. And then if the person writes something that you don't kind of agree with, that you talk to them in a certain way. What do you think about that, Dylan?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the benefit of pair programming is a stronger team cohesion, because it really forces you to work hands on with your teammates and be there and connect, and it also forces a dialogue. So part of the PR process is it's a dialogue on best practices, better code, except instead of waiting to the PR process, you're doing it live in the moment, which is really a powerful thing. I will say that it is a conversation, right? Just because the navigator suggests one way of doing it doesn't mean the navigator can't be wrong, because they're going to be the driver at some point and they'll be wrong. So it's not like you have an absolute authority on either side. But I do think that there are some developers who just aren't going to like it, because they just, I don't know. So some people just are content doing the bare minimum, and the idea that they're going to be sort of scrutinized in the moment, or like that code sometimes is almost like an art. It's a craft, Uncle Bob calls it, that says we're craftsmen, and there's some truth to that. And so when someone says, hey, what do you think about modifying your craft to something better, that if you have a big ego, it can make it really hard to make it part of the process.
Have you ever pair program with a contractor? I was thinking about that. I've worked with some contractors in the past, and especially if they're new to your code bases, I was thinking maybe that would be another way you can to help someone out. They're not necessarily on your team, and it wouldn't really help with the team cohesion part, but it could help with just getting the code done.
Yes, I've had to do that numerous times. So, at numerous organizations, as anyone who's worked with consultants on a project, a lot of the times they come and they go. Even if you have a consultant that's been hired, a consultant agency, sometimes they'll swap two devs out for two new ones with a week's notice or no notice, and be like, hey, Dave is gone, but here's Bob and Larry. Like it just sort of works that way, and you start from square one. And then they have to get up to date on some of your practices and standards and items like that. And, forget even the code base, which is very important, but just, they have to ramp up in technologies. You might a common example would be like, oh, hey, we here are some consultants for the front end. They're great with React and they know how JavaScript and everything, but they've never worked in Angular. It's not that they can't work in Angular, they're just not at a professional level where, they're not going to maybe write it in the best way. So pair programming is a great way to introduce your team to the code base and give them an opportunity to say, well, why'd you do it this way? And maybe they have some input, and then you go, you know what? I don't know. That was a really stupid idea. Maybe we should change that. Or we did it this way, and this is why, and this is, this is how this works. And, I've had to do it numerous times at numerous organizations, especially when I'm trying to skill up some of these potential consultants.
So I have a few more questions for you since we're on this topic of consultants. So we've talked about doing it with interviewing, team cohesion with your normal team, with contractors. Is there any other time you would do pair programming?
I like to do it when there is something that is new. So like in the sense of right now I'm making a strong push to work more in DevOps and the back end. I am at a proficient level that any feature asked in the front end I can pretty much complete, and I can complete it fast and it'll be well developed just because I've been spending so much of my time there. But in the back end, it's been one of those things where I know that we're working Nest.js and Node and Express and things that I'm familiar with, but not that I feel like, oh, hey, I'm going to do the best solution. So a lot of what I've been doing is like, hey, can I get can I get my teammate who is much more proficient in it for 30 minutes, say, this is what I'm going to do. And like, you want to just sort of navigate. So I find it helpful for my own sake to reach out, even on those times that like we traditionally don't pair program a lot because we're all remote, and it's not that you can't pair program while you're remote, but like the expectation is that you should be able to do your job well in various aspects without the help, and because you may not have they may not be available to help you and work through that. But I find it in those circumstances to be very helpful when I just want to figure out, like I have working code and I want to go through it and be like, this is how I go. And it's a great learning process for me. It's still with your teammates, but I think it's slightly different than actually trying to deliver just a ticket. It's more about the learning and best practices. Oh, did you know this existed? All these libraries and frameworks and languages have so much to them that sometimes you'll never come across something that's very valuable.
Yeah, it just reminds me of my own work a little bit. I think anytime we get on the same screen together, do some screen sharing, it's valuable. Although I don't know, like at least in my work and my current work and a few other places I worked at, we haven't done like traditional screen sharing or pair programming in the way we're describing here in this podcast. But we have at times, I've been stuck on a problem or I had a question on the code base, and I'll just get someone else on the Skype or Zoom or Google Hangouts, and we'll just talk about the problem, and I'll share the code. And so it's not like, hey, you're the navigator, and I'm running this. It's not like that at all. But I think it's sort of similar to pair programming that way. I think if we wanted to do it right, we would have to kind of set more formal time. Like, okay, here 2 hours today. Let's pair program together. This is our objective. We need to get this feature or this bug fix out. Let's work together. You tell me what to do. I'll drive. You navigate. Things like that. Do you think that's the best way, or do you think the informal, just come jump on a screen share is okay too?
I think the informal is probably the more practical, just because, I mean, as I've found, especially as you go and you start owning parts of the code base, right? So like, I typically own the front end but you might have a team of 5, but you have 10 repos, and like just by the very nature of your goal will own certain repos, which will then, you might be solving bug issues on that repo, or you might be talking to the business about those specific parts of the code that you sort of know inside and out. So I think that's probably the more practical approach, although I don't necessarily consider that pair programming. I consider that more just like partnering up on something, in the sense of like, oh, we're teammates and we're helping each other. So it's I'm sure it sort of depends. Like, I think the best form of pair programming is saying, hey, I got ticket ABC. let's get started and at least get the boilerplate done. Let's get, maybe we don't need to work on the whole ticket together, but we have till lunch. Let's spend 2 hours. We'll dive into it. This is what we're doing. This is what, let's just get the bulk of it. And yeah, you can come back to it, but you don't necessarily have to. That's one thing about pair programming is that in a perfect world, right? Like you would start a ticket and you'd finish a ticket, right? But that's just not always going to be practical. People are going to have things going on. But I think both are, I guess, are pair programming, but I think one is much more truer than the other, I guess.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think if you have if you're more structured, that's a truer version of pair programming. But if you sort of have informal conversations about the code, then that's not quite the same, but it has the same sort of purpose. Yeah, I want to talk about you, to you. Excuse me, stumbling over my words, about web development. It's specifically in pair programming for that, because as we know in the web dev world, and I'm talking mostly about the front end, that we're dealing with kind of two different skill sets at times. We may be deep diving into HTML and CSS and figuring out how to use, center a div and use Flexbox and grid and how to add a little animation flourish, how to add some forms. On the other hand, we might be knee deep in a component and we're trying to add some properties to it and trying to pass things into it and doing fun things there and adding logic in. Do you think that pair programming is more successful in, like, would you pair program with someone on HTML and CSS, or would you pair program with someone more on the JavaScript component side? Do you think there's any advantages or disadvantages, or what do you think?
I think that from if you take out just sort of the pair programming aspect, and if you were to ask me where I think the average senior developer that's a web developer struggles most in, if I was to say, the back end, the database, the front end, I think the front end is sort of the horror zone of a lot of software engineers. Like there's just something about it between the moving pieces, the design elements, the, having to handle responsive aspects, and sort of connecting that, especially in past times, has been changing so much that is a great spot to pair program on. Because I think it's one of the things that people avoid. I really do. There's just something about, I know devs who like specifically don't want to learn JavaScript, even if they go and work in Node and TypeScript, because they're afraid that eventually they'll have to work in the front end. So I don't think from a standpoint that there's any particular, this is better, this is worse. I think a lot of it is, where you can provide value. And I just happen to think that particular portion of the code, if you have, is a great way to sort of force somebody to be in an area where they're uncomfortable, but now they sort of have a support structure at the same time through the pair programming to make them more comfortable with whatever it is that they've been avoiding.
Yeah, I just haven't ever done one specifically for like front end code. I want to try it because at least for not doing something specifically for like divs and like, what would you be like, navigator be like, okay, add this HTML div and add a class to it. And you're like, okay, I'm doing that. Now jump into the code here and add some CSS selectors. And okay, I guess it would work too. I guess this works, and I'm just maybe overthinking it. I guess that would work too.
Yeah, and I mean, it'd be slightly different. It'd be like, oh, well, let's not do inline styling, for instance. Let's use a class. Or oh, I see you're using ID here, but this is a Angular component. We don't want to use IDs because it may not be unique, so let's use a class. Oh, you have a UL with a div nested in there instead of an LI. That's sort of breaking semantic HTML. How can we go about that? Or okay, cool. Now forget the HTML and CSS aspect. Maybe we're using Sass, and did you know that we could use the ampersand to assign a pseudo class nested within it? And it's always going to be somewhat relevant. And these are things that, like, if you're a front end developer, may all sort of make sense. But sometimes we slip up, myself included, or sometimes somebody who is a full stack developer, and anyone who's been a full stack developer like myself, what you'll find out a lot of times is that your job is never split 50-50. It's like you sort of fall into these niches of 80-20, right? Like I do about 20% back end, about 80% front end, or maybe you're the inverse of that, and you go and you just start owning pieces of the code. And so those best practices and standards of where you're at, that it'd be nice to believe like, oh, hey, everyone's a super senior in every aspect of software development, but that's just not the reality.
Yeah, that's true. And you can learn something too. I guess if you're the navigator and you're saying, hey, we should do this, add this div here, add this class here. And then they're like, hey, why don't we add a section in here? Why don't we do a little more HTML, a more semantic HTML here, and add a header and a footer? And like, oh, I didn't even know we should do that. And you could probably collaborate and make even a better product. That's interesting. I'm just kind of thinking how that would work. The one I would say I had one more experience with pair programming, or two more. Oh, in that same interview I talked about earlier, where I didn't do so well, and I was a little nervous, and they were telling me what to do, and I was sort of driving, and they were navigating. Well, after I had paired with one person for, I don't know, a day. I think it was a 2-day interview, so I think I was 2 or 3 different people I paired with. The second day, I was paired with like this super senior dev that was an Emacs expert. And if you don't know, there's Vim and Emacs, and they're both text editors, and you can kind of add some plugins to make them more like IDEs. But this person was an amazing developer, and they were working on the back end, and they were going through so many different screens so quickly, I could not understand what they were doing. Like, she was like an amazing Emacs expert, and she was just going from one screen to the other, copying, pasting code, and not explaining any of it to me. And I was just sitting behind her, and I remember I think we did it for over an hour. And every time I asked a question, she'd give me like a one-word answer, and it was just super awkward. And she was basically doing the driving and navigating, and I was just like watching over her shoulder. And then I think I remember after like an hour and a half, she's like, let me see if I can get you to sit with someone else. I'm taking lunch. I'm like, okay, thanks. And I felt like she was definitely doing it wrong. Like, that wasn't the right way to do it. And it actually kind of soured me to the whole interview. And when I didn't get it, I was almost like thinking that maybe like I should have done better on the paired programming part. Maybe I should have like jumped in when she was, switching between 10 different screens. She did ask me like one question about errors, like which error code to use. Like, should I use error code 500 or 503 or 403 or 404? And I think I didn't answer it quite right. And then after that, she just kind of ignored me and just worked. And I was thinking, yeah, this is not the right way to do it. So that was one bad experience I had with pair programming.
Yeah. I think that, I don't know. It definitely, you have to have some sort of, one, I don't think interview is a great place to do it. Two, I'm not doing 2-day interviews to anybody out there listening, so get lost if you ever ask me to do multiple day interviews. God, I can rant for days about interviews, man. I'm so sick of these, like I don't know, like I get we're not like delivering pizzas anymore, you know what I mean? Like I get that, but like there's got to be a little bit of a strong interview. But I mean, how many hours is expected? Like, we got thousands of hours of content out here about software engineering, yet I still got to interview for like 20 additional hours. Come on, man. But yeah,
people who've listened to our Tech with Tim interview, which I think is coming out with, I think it's already came out. We talked about that even like Tim has like 1 million YouTube subscribers. He has like crazy videos on Django and machine learning and all these topics. And when he interviewed at these FANGs, they still made him do like the whiteboarding. They still made him go through the whole process. Like, nothing in life is for free, especially when you're going to pay someone like hundreds of thousands of dollars. I wish the employers would be like, hey, listen, I see that you have 300 videos and that you've talked about this ad nauseum and that you have an amazing podcast. Which, by the way, anybody that's listening to us right now, make sure you go to iTunes and leave us a review. I just checked. We only have like 3 reviews, and we need to bring that up. I should read them out loud, I should say. But but make sure you leave a review, and don't leave the review that one guy said that this podcast is boring, because this podcast is not boring. I'm telling you.
Fuck that guy.
I saw one guy. That's all he let. That's his one review. This one guy. It was just one sentence. This podcast is boring.
It's like, all
Yeah.
right, man. Yeah, come on, man. Get out of here. Goddamn haters. Yeah. uh, I guess we should probably talk a little bit about mob programming as well.
Wait, before we go into that topic, do you have? I was just looking up and googling. I guess there's a bunch of different ways to actually do pair programming remotely. I
Mhm.
think all of us are thinking about everybody in the office, but I know a lot of people, because of the pandemic, a lot of people working from home. Do you have some suggestions on what software to use? I have a few of them listed. I just grabbed real quickly.
Yeah. So I mean, most people are going to be using like Slack or Teams or Zoom or something with some screen sharing software. That's usually good enough to get going. However, if you're using VS Code, there is VS Code Liveshare, and one of the benefits of that. Now, the extension last I checked was in beta, so that's been a couple months. Hopefully, it's out by then, but it was a little buggy then. But the cool thing about that is you can actually see people jumping around in your code and see who's doing what. And if you give them certain permissions, they can actually edit the file on your computer as you're going. So there's a lot of cool software out there for that.
Yeah, I did. I tried that once. I did the VS Live Code Share on a YouTube video with a buddy of mine, and it was kind of neat. You can actually see their cursor. You can see them typing. You basically both typing in the same code base because you're sharing the same code base, which is really neat. I think you pick which person is the sharer of the code. I'll give a shout out. There used to be a program called Screen Hero, so that's what we were using in the interview I've referenced a couple of times now. That product is pretty much died. It was bought out by Slack, and a new app that's come out recently in the last couple of years is called Tuple, and that's a really good shared programming app, a pair programming app. It's Mac only, but it has just tons of features. There's some things when you get into more sophisticated pair programming, at least I've heard, that become really helpful, like sharing the cursor, being able to write in their other, because a lot of screen sharing programs aren't very good. Like if you actually want to take control of the other person's computer or type something or highlight something, like they're not that good. And Tuple app actually has a lot of those things. So if you're going to be hardcore into pair programming, you may want to take a step up from the screen sharing programs out there. But I think if you're starting off, at least I've seen, and as to Dylan's point, like just using Zoom or Google Hangouts or something like that, anything that you could just share your screen is probably a good first step. But I think once you get a little more sophisticated, looking at something like Tuple, and there's a few others out there, might be worth a while doing.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily like I think some people might be picturing like, oh, you're going to be working this file, I'm going to be hacking this out, and we're going to be hacking that out. That's not necessarily the intent a lot of times, although I suppose you could do that. Typically, when I've been using these screen sharing softwares where you can type, it's when I'm as the navigator trying to communicate an idea verbally, but sometimes things get lost in translation. So you just sort of type it out and be like, this is what I was thinking. And then it starts clicking a little bit. Um, that's usually how you're going to be using that sort of like, hey, edit this file, or what file to go to, or what are you saying? I don't really get it. And you just, okay, here's a little like, this is what I meant.
Yeah, I think going to the more sophisticated programs like Tuple will give you things like I said before, like giving you mouse and keyboard control to both parties and taking over with one click, and then also sharing video and audio at the same time, so you can have your webcam on and have audio, so somebody could see you while you're doing the pair programming, which is really important. Some of these apps don't allow you to do all those things in one. I'm sure there's a bunch of other things like drawing on the screen, having a clean UI, having a really crisp video, things like that. But just starting off, maybe just try your basic screen sharing program.
Yeah, I
So
think
yeah, tell me
just
about mob programming. I don't want to derail us too much.
yeah. Not really too much to say about mob programming. Very similar to pair programming, except it usually involves your entire team. And so you might have a room, or 2020 with the world on fire. You might just have a video room, video group, and it's one of those items where it's you do have a driver. It's typically one person on a laptop that is usually vocally saying to the group what it is they're doing, why they're doing it as they type, which is a skill in itself to be able to sort of narrate what you're doing. And then you have a group of people who are sort of in communication, and sometimes they might have one person that speaks to the driver, but the idea is that the entire team is sort of developing the feature as you go. A couple of benefits to this: one, you get more input. There is sort of a diminishing returns, right? Too many cooks in the kitchen at times, but if you keep it sort of orderly, then you're able to have more brain power on a single problem.
I have never done this, but I was on one team that, well, actually, I was in a QA team a long, long time ago, and the developers would have code review sessions in front of everyone during their team meetings every week, and they would pick someone's code every single week to like kind of go over and nitpick. So I guess it's not the same as mob programming, because I don't remember if they actually went and edited the code live with everybody in the same room, but it was at least like a group code review / editing session, and then the person would go back and fix the code. I think sometimes they would actually live code and edit it. I guess that's sort of like code mob programming. Have you seen that like during team meetings? People would do that.
Yeah, I've done that myself as well. Where, hey, we built this, and it's a knowledge transfer both ways. Like, oh, hey, I built this feature. It's reusable. We can use it for X, Y, and Z. This is how it works. And then you dive into a technical perspective. So not only does your teammates know it exists, but then you have a chance to retroactively say, oh, cool. Well, what do you think about adding this? What do you think about doing this? What do you think about doing that? And you can have a nice impact there from a team perspective. Because sometimes everyone's in their own little world. Like, you're doing your feature, I'm doing my feature, and there's a general sprint goal, but that's usually it. Sometimes some things get lost in between the cracks between the devs.
Yeah, I think more those type of collaborations, like where you get everybody in on the same page, is just kind of makes for a better code base and better organization, because you can tell that if companies are doing things like mob programming, they probably are serious about code quality, which is not always the case in some organizations. Although I could see where some developers would think that those meetings are a waste of time, because if there's like 10 developers in one room and now you times that by their hourly rate, you're spending $50,000 on one meeting to make one code base or one feature just a little bit better. But I guess that you just have to be careful about how many times you do this and how many developers you put in the same room and things like that.
Yeah, I will say from another perspective of mob programming is that if a team is new to pair programming and the team cohesion isn't quite there, I think mob programming is a great way to sort of build in that respect and that demeanor. Because if it's a one-on-one sort of conversation, sometimes things may get lost in translation, or maybe the teammates don't have the best sort of, you're not quite teammates yet, I guess would be a nice way of putting it. But that sort of respect and consideration in a group sense is usually much better when there's witnesses, I guess. So mob programming is great for that as well.
Got to hold everybody accountable to it. I can understand that. It almost reminds me too, I'm just kind of riffing off this mob programming idea because I haven't done it. It reminds me of like an open source project in some ways, where everybody can contribute to one code base and make it better, and then there's a whole PR and review process. But I mean, obviously it's a little different because it's live. It's more asynchronous, not synchronous, I suppose, because people are talking live and doing it. It's not like an open source project where you make a change, you push a pull request, and then you have to get someone to review it and then do it. It's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, and much like pair programming, there are general guidelines and rules, but for the most part, the core idea is to work together on a team and find what works for you. I think when looking at some of these agile practices, that a lot of the baseline sort of rules and standards are correct, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for your team or organization. But you could tweak things and still stay true to the goal.
Yeah. Do you ever see a problem where people, like if you start doing pair programming in an organization, or then maybe start with mob programming first a couple of times, that it just adds like just another meeting people have to attend, and that it's not as productive at first? Or do you get like pushback from the team?
I don't look at it as a meeting, and I haven't had any developers that look at it because it's technical in nature. A lot of times when I think about meetings, I think about a lot of talking and no code. Like that's sort of how I think about it. But it is true that there are people who just they want to be left alone. I don't think that's the right attitude to have as a software engineer. I think working as a team member and being open to things and saying and understanding like, hey, this is the benefits, and there's stats to support it. It's not just pulling out of my ass. But I do think that there are always going to be people who just don't want to do anything. They just want to be left alone and collect their checks and stop being bothered by me, I guess.
And yeah, that's not great.
Right, anything else we want to talk about this?
No, thank you for answering my questions, Dylan. I'm new to this, so I'm learning too. I'm definitely, I think I'm going to be working with some contractors soon, and I think we're going to try the pair programming. Like the first thing, like the first assignment we give to them, we're going to spend maybe a couple of days just working together on it. Just get them up to speed on the code base, just give them a little bit more guidance, see exactly their level and where they're at. Maybe I don't think I'll be super strict about it, but at least a few hours a day to start off with. And maybe that'll help us be more productive in the long term. One thing too is with pair programming, just thinking like that takes me away from stuff I need to do. But I think if we work together on something, it'll speed the contractor up too.
Yeah, it's always interesting to try to weigh that healthy balance of what's best for the team versus what's best for you in terms of like you still have your own work and stuff like that. But I always try to just say what's going to deliver the most value long term. But it's not always an easy decision, right? When sometimes like, oh well, we could deliver 5 points instead of 3, but if those 3 points are like, yo, we need these 3 points, then sometimes you gotta just deliver slightly less value, but more important items at times.
I agree. That's all. No, that's all I got. It very, very interesting. And if you guys are listening right now and you've tried pair programming, tweet me. I'm at ErikCH, ERIKCH. Let me know how it went and just reference this episode.
Yeah, and don't forget to leave that review either.
Yeah. Yes.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to find more about what I'm up to, go to dylanisrael.com.
And if you want to know what I'm up to, you can check out my website at erik.video. If you haven't already, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And if you do, you might even be featured on our next episode. Don't forget to check out the website at selftaughtornot.com. From there, you can sign up for a mailing list where we give away free courses and a bunch of cool stuff. And we'll also let you know when the next episode comes out. And finally, if you didn't know, we have a Facebook group. It's called Code, Tech, and Caffeine. We have over 10,000 members, and you can find the link at selftaughtornot.com. So come join us. We have tons of developers willing to help you guys, mentor you guys. Check it out. Just make sure you go to selftaughtornot.com and check out the Code, Tech, and Caffeine link. Thanks, and take care.